Good afternoon, everyone. It's noon, so I think we'll go ahead and get started, and folks can join in as we move along. So I'd like to welcome you to the fourth webinar in the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperative series, Cooperative Solutions for Community Needs. My name is Lynn Pittman. I'm an outreach specialist at the UW Center for Cooperatives, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. The topic of today's webinar is cooperatives and community broadband needs. I'm very pleased today to be joined by two people who are very knowledgeable about cooperatives and broadband. Shannon Clark, the CEO and General Manager of Richland Electric Cooperative, and Jerry Schneider, CEO and General Manager of Marquette Adams Telephone Cooperative. Before we get started, I've got a couple of housekeeping items. All of you participants are muted, but you can submit questions for the speakers via the Q&A function on your computer, which will be at either the top or the bottom where the menu bar appears when you scroll over it with your mouse. We'll be answering the questions in the Q&A session following the speaker presentations. And if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat function on the menu bar, and we'll be monitoring that as well. The webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on our website along with the presentations. I'll be sending out a link to that later on today. So to get started, it first might be useful to briefly review the definition of a cooperative. A cooperative is an organization or business venture that is owned and democratically controlled by its members, the people who use its services. In the case of an electric or telecom cooperative, generally the customers who use those services are the member owners. Democratic member control is exercised by electing a board of directors, typically on a one-member, one-vote basis. The cooperative general manager is accountable to that elected board. And cooperatives are operated to meet member needs for services. If there is any operating surplus that may be reinvested in the cooperative or allocated to members based on their use or patronage. So in Wisconsin, we have 24 rural electric cooperatives in the central and western parts of the state that distribute electricity to their members. Over the years, some rural electrics have worked out arrangements with wireless, satellite, or other providers to provide internet options for members. Shannon will be talking about the continuing response by his and other cooperatives to the broadband needs of members in their communities. In Wisconsin, we also have 11 cooperatives and telecom cooperatives in the northwestern and western parts of the state. As of 2011, they were responsible for about 35,000 access lines statewide. Wisconsin telecom cooperatives are typical of many telecom cooperatives nationwide and have invested in fiber, including fiber to the premises. Jerry will be talking about the ways his co-op continues to build and leverage their fiber network. Now, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Shannon Clark. Shannon serves as the CEO and General Manager of Southwest Wisconsin's Richland Electric Cooperative, an electric distribution cooperative servicing approximately 4,000 accounts. Shannon is also the CEO of Genuine Telecom, a Wisconsin competitive telecommunications company owned by Richland and two neighboring telephone cooperatives. In his 27 years at Richland, he's led efforts to position the Richland community as a leader in electrical and telecommunication services, including automated metering infrastructure, demand-side management, distributed generation, including community-owned solar, fiber to the premises, IP video, and a host of other broadband services. In 2017, he was awarded the National Rural Electric Association's Region 5 Outstanding Service Award and the Wisconsin Electric Cooperation Association's Ally of Cooperative Electrification Award. So now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Shannon. Shannon?
Thanks, Lynn. Hopefully I've got my slides up there for everyone to see it.
Yep.
As Lynn mentioned, questions and answers are going to be at the end, but I do have my Q&A dialogue. If there's something that just needs clarification or I completely missed the point, pop something on the Q&A and hopefully I'll be able to see that. As Lynn also mentioned, I'm a CEO of an electric co-op, and that's probably a unique business for most of the people that are involved in broadband. Overall, I think most cooperatives, telecom cooperatives, electric cooperatives, supply cooperatives, we all exist, as Lynn mentioned earlier, to serve the needs of our members. Every day I take a look when I come into our office and I see that our mission included, when we started, enhance the quality of life for rural Americans. It didn't say by providing electric service, it didn't say by providing broadband. It was somewhat of a limitless opportunity that co-ops had. We just happened to specialize in electricity, but that was driven by a need, and perhaps a little historical perspective is in order. Broadband, it's really just information exchange. And a lot of this, I've been around since the 1990s involved in electric co-ops, and a lot of these things are all solved the same way. It doesn't matter if it was historically back, telegraph, telephone, teletype, all of the items listed on the screen in front of you, they were just outgrowths of a need. Broadband's a little bit different in the fact there's a couple of changes. Electricity, when our co-op was being formed, our members went door to door and said, would you like electricity? And everybody said yes. And there wasn't anybody that said, no, I like my Delco plant that I have, for those of you that know what those were, or no, the gas lantern is okay. Nobody really said that. So, and there was nobody else beating down the door to get there. But we did see that only electricity and only telephone were the areas that cooperatives really got together and said, we're going to build infrastructure to rural America. That was because broadband, like most of the technologies, they had electricity at that time had started in populated areas. If you take a look, even here in Richland County, the city of Richland Center predated rural Richland County by over 30 years. There was electricity in the city of Richland Center 30 years before it made it just 5 miles out of town. Richland Center is not really a populated area. Richland County certainly is less populated, but a lot of those were advanced by Madison, Milwaukee, and broadband's the same way. We saw broadband many years ago showing up in the cities. And part of the problem with any infrastructure project is that it needs scale. And those cities had that scale. They had that population density necessary to cover the capital cost. But typically, when you look at broadband, it started out by connecting population centers to other population centers. If you go back up to the top and you take a look at the items I listed there, telegraph. There weren't many telegraph places in between the continental United States, except the East Coast and the West Coast when it first came on. Later on, we started to see more of those areas get a telegraph machine. Telephone. Rural telephone cooperatives saw the same need electric co-ops did. Rural America was getting left behind. Even dial-up internet. That's where I cut my teeth. Dial-up internet. I recall when I went to a university program here in Richland Center, and I'm about 1993, taught by a university professor called Introduction to the Internet. And I went into that room, and there were 60 people from Richland County. And the professor asked, how many of you are using the internet? And about half of them raised their hand. And I thought, wow, I've never even really heard of this. His next question was, what does it cost you to connect to the internet? And comments were $150, $200, $280 a month was the highest I heard. That's because it was long distance. There was no local number. And that's where we got started. Dial-up internet, we provided a local number. Seemed easy enough. We put a data line in, sent it to an internet national access point, and we were on our way. But technology is growing very fast. People want it always on. We had 56 kilobit. Then we started talking about DSL. Then it was cable modems and other versions of DSL. And now we're at the point of fiber. And everybody's talking about the Internet of Things. But it's been really slow to reach out here to rural America. namely because there's just not a lot of people. But I think we have to really make sure that we understand that areas can be left behind. And if they do, that's a true hit to economic development. If you look, I'm going to slip back to that slide I just advanced from. That graphic in the right, that's not a broadband network. That's the railroad system in the United States. I'd like you to take a look at the right-hand side and see how many places you can find a rail line in the United States. And then look out to the rural areas of America and see how many places you can find a rail line. If you look back into the 1800s, that was just simply 2 or 3 lines across the country. Interestingly enough, if you've traveled to the west, you know that there are many towns out there that did not get a rail stop. Those railroad towns, as they became known, were success. Those without the railroad, they weren't. Interstate road systems, no different. If you didn't have an off-ramp on the interstate, Route 66, look at the towns along the way there. When Route 66 was displaced by the interstate highway system, look at the towns and cities that have not thrived due to the lack of an interstate off-ramp. Airports hold the same thing. But uniquely enough, electricity and telephone, they didn't bypass rural America. They did for a while. But the cooperative business model, coupled with the REA program of the 1930s, recognized that if people got together, they worked together, and they could work with a motive other than profit, they could very well serve themselves. And that fit wonderfully with rural America. Today, rural America is very much a do-it-yourself type of culture. Now we come to a time where we're threatened with another bypass, the technology bypass. A lot of rural America doesn't enjoy the broadband that you can get in more densely populated areas. There are exceptions. A lot of those, though, are due in large part to cooperatives, to telephone cooperatives, and independents who started in rural America. Most of them started under the REA program. But they all had one thing in common. They had a community that got together and wanted to be able to provide for themselves. But the challenges are different. I've heard people say, building broadband to rural America, we can use the REA model. Not quite. The REA model had 2 services that were independent. There was only one electricity. There was only one telephone. There weren't different flavors of that. And now we find ourselves where you can get internet access, and I use that term different than broadband, via a whole bunch of ways, from satellite to Wi-Fi to now on cellular telephones to DSL, cable modems, and fiber. Fiber being probably the most future-proof and probably the one that scales the best. But it's extremely expensive, very capital-intensive projects. I'll just give you an example. About 10 years ago, Richland Electric Co-op looked at what it would take to serve the unserved areas of Richland County. Now keep in mind that we have 3 telephone cooperatives and 1 independent that serve in Richland County. And they've done a marvelous job of building fiber out and broadband out. Richland Grant Telephone, Vernon Telephone, and Laval Telephone Cooperatives all serve in our county. So those members, they really had their needs met. Hillsborough, an independent telephone company, had built out a small area where they serve in Richland County as well. So we were left with just a smattering, if you will, of people that weren't served. That smattering, though, happens to represent about half of our population. But in those areas, there's only 3.4 customers per route mile of fiber, per route mile of anything, per route mile of electricity lines. And the demographics are different. In our pilot project, we built fiber to an area, and we passed 50 homes. The adoption rates are slower, and they're lower. People are a little less likely to take broadband than they would have been electricity or telephone in the 30s. And part of that's cost, part of that's just technology adoption, but it's growing, but it grows slow. And when you take a look at that Richland County number that I gave you, or that Richland County demographic I gave you, that cost was $22 million. $22 million is very close to the total net worth of Richland Electric Co-op to build a project that may or may not be fully subscribed. The slide shows you that broadband is competitive. Even when there's nothing else there, there is still something else there, or there may be something else there. Satellite reaches everywhere, and it may meet the needs of some people. You can't count on a satellite provider being a fiber subscriber. you can't count on a cellular subscriber becoming a fiber subscriber. And furthermore, as I've learned, in the 1990s, we deployed a plant that was a combination of fiber and of copper. We found that technology changes really fast. When I've talked to my fellow managers, and particularly the telephone co-op managers, you'll hear like from Jerry, one of the things that always surprises me is that when Richland Electric Co-op goes out and spends $1 million on plants, you can really tell it. You drive down the road and you see new power lines in the air, or maybe you see a cable plow going down the road. There's a lot of stuff there. Think of that as a really big bag full of groceries. I talk to my telephone co-op managers and I say, yeah, we just spent $1 million and we've been out in the field for a year. Some of them will tell me, hey, we just bought switches and switch gear that was $1 million and you can fit it all in a very small office. It's very expensive. And oh, by the way, in 5 years, it's going to be obsolete. But electric and telephone co-ops present a solution to the problem that we have, as well as other community-minded organizations that subscribe to the same principles as cooperatives. It may not be limited to just telephone co-ops and electric co-ops. I've seen others that want to be involved. I've seen school districts, I've seen community area networks, I've seen townships, cities, villages, towns. I've seen private groups get together and form essentially quasi-cooperatives where it's do-it-yourself. Those rural community citizens, including those of electric co-ops, they might already be served. Maybe they are served but not quite good enough, or they're not served at all. Telephone co-ops have done a marvelous job of getting broadband to their customers. The majority of it is now via fiber, which is going to provide well into the future. Jerry will talk about that a little later. But those others that are being left behind, they don't know where it's coming from. And most of those are going to rely on unique partnerships. Here's an example of what you might find in a community. If you look at the blue, those are telephone co-ops. If you look at the orange ones, those are more than likely the regional bell companies or something similar, price cap carriers as they're known in the business. And then the yellow would be the independents. Independents and co-ops share a similar set of values. The ownership structure is different. But in many areas of Wisconsin, what we're finding is that the orange bars are the areas that are still waiting for service in the sparsely populated areas. Those orange bars, they've provided service where it's economically feasible, but it's been really tough to get them to be convinced to go out into an area where there's only 3.4 miles or consumers per mile. So each community might be different. One might have a lot of telephone co-op subscribers, one may have a lot of independents, one may have a lot of RBOC subscribers. But electric and telephone co-ops, they really both have needs. Electric co-ops now, interestingly enough, are finding themselves a little bit underserved. As we're looking at cybersecurity and automation and automated meter reading and home automation and energy management and smart grid technologies so that we can provide a reliable electric service even through the worst of weather events, that requires a really good communications network. Because of cybersecurity, many electric co-ops have looked at building their own, and they've looked at building fiber just because they want to have the control. The cybersecurity requirements for an electric provider are very, very burdensome for good reason. So you build a network and our data requirements are really low, but it really doesn't make any sense to build a small data network because the cost is actually in the installation, not necessarily in the fiber. Energy management is becoming a consumer trend. Nest thermostats are a perfect example. You can have a Nest thermostat, but if you don't have a broadband connection, really all it is a programmable thermostat that doesn't take advantage of all of its learning capability. And electric co-ops have a very vested interest in community development and growth. Most of us have economic development professionals in our office. Telephone co-ops have the same things. They have networks and experience, frankly, that scales. They've made large investments for very sparsely populated areas. You don't get the opportunity to go to a provider for a switch or for a router and say, I only need a router that'll do 3,000 people. They say, well, our router does 25,000 people. Do you have one smaller? No, the price is the same. So adding customers provides incremental value for them. Because now if you can take that same device and serve twice as many people, it lowers the fixed cost. And they too have a vested interest in their community and the development and the growth. And it doesn't stop there. Other interests exist, many I've talked to, some of you that are on the call I'm familiar with, and what we've talked about, how can my community get involved and be able to ensure this, that this is going to come and that we're going to have some success. Going back to that same chart, so where are the opportunities? If you take a look at Community 1, that's a good opportunity. There's an unserved group probably in the orange bar. You've got a telephone co-op that probably has some scale, and maybe an independent that can reach out to some areas. That's a place to partner, to say to the telephone co-op or to the independent, what can we do to help? We've got right of way, or we can allow you on our roads. We can do these types of things to help. Maybe you're community number 3, where there's a telephone co-op that's just really could use more scale, or an independent that could use more scale, and you've got a huge unserved need, which is going to increase subscriber growth. That's a really great opportunity. So you look at how the service is provided today and who's willing to do that. But there is no one size fits all. Each of these projects are independent and they're separate. One of the things that you can run into, and I've seen this, is that if you have a situation where, for example, a small community, maybe it has a school, a hospital, and a bank, maybe a couple of retailers, and they get together and they say, you know what, we're going to provide our own internet. And if there's a telephone co-op or an independent or even a company like Genuine Telecom right down the road that's thinking about expanding there, and you only take the best subscribers, those anchor institutions, what about the people that are going to be left behind because you've just reduced the scale? So I think when we look at communities, we have to look at this from the all-encompassing approach so that we don't find ourselves splitting the market into segments that can't be sustainable. So partnerships are going to be required for rural America to be able to solve this broadband dilemma that we're in. So either be a part of that with an independent and separate project, help with that, or stand in support. It's a lot better to have somebody in your neighborhood providing service in your community than somebody who only has a profit motive. So if you don't want to be involved, don't stand in the way of somebody else who does want to be involved, because someday you might want to be involved. And support the ideas. That's legislatively and through policy. Then share resources. Maybe there's only going to be one owner, but do you have something to offer? Does your community or your business have something to offer that can maybe create that scale where people are going to be able to do this project and do so affordably? Some of the options include joint projects. You can share planning. If you're going to be doing underground work, you can place duct, you can share right-of-way, or you can work with people who do have right-of-way. Partnerships, it's an increased level of formality. You're maybe going to look at this a little bit different. You need a board that's supportive, you need a community that's supportive, and you have to have that participation, and that takes boots on the ground. People have got to say, we want to do this, we're going to work together, and we're going to form a business that with each other that's going to solve this issue. Or maybe you've got a group of people that say, you know what, I really don't know much about this, but I'm willing to put some money into it. Maybe it's a shareholder, or something better, a tried and proven test would be a cooperative. There's some milestones to being successful. They're listed on the screen in front of you. First, you do need to define the need. In many cases, I read the paper where they say there's just no rural broadband. And in reality, there is. It may be just a little ways away and it only takes a little boost. A lot of the broadband data maps are historically inaccurate. It's awful hard when you have this not knowing who serves what, but make sure you know what the need is and who's going to subscribe. What inventory resources do you have, human and others? You have to model how you're going to take those resources and put them into this project and explore business relationships. And finally, you're going to have business planning, because many of these projects can go along thinking, I'm going to sell this to the world. I will tell you, I will admit to the fact that we did that. Our first initial survey said if we built broadband, we're going to get 70% adoption rate. Well, we found out that we got there, but we started when we needed 70, we only had 30. And that's a tough financial situation. So feasibility studies and things of that nature are useful. And then finally, making the decision. I've talked about many of these things on this slide. Are you really underserved or underserved? Are there new technologies on the horizon? Are you in a community where 5G is going to solve this problem? Or do you need a fiber network? Or is somebody going to do that? What about resources? You have human resources, you have people. Do they really scale, or are they really so busy today that they can't take on more? What are you going to do yourself, and what are you going to contract? Who's going to be in charge, and how are you going to assign the cost? You have to know who you're dealing with. You have to know what the cultures are. Oil and water don't mix well. Know if you're oil, know if you're water, or know if you're something that mixes with your partners. Business planning, the only thing worse than starting a broadband project or not starting a broadband project is starting a broadband project and failing and not providing the service. And as a go, no-go decision, any unanswered questions have to be answered. Everything has to be put on the table. You can't stand back and sandbag. Some final thoughts. There are natural partnerships. Electric and telephone co-ops are probably one of those, but others do exist. Community development organizations, municipalities, others can be there as well. It starts with someone. Someone's got to step up and go talk to a potential partner. And there really are no stupid questions. There are questions that you don't know the answers to. Ignorance is not something to be ashamed of. Not educating yourself perhaps is, and you have to be honest about it. This business will always be about service. It's not about, honestly, it's not about price. If it's about price, then the service is a problem. You have to make it about service. Look at what others have done. There have been many successes. There's also been failures. Anticipate the change that's coming, and above all, if you're a co-op, understand that your model requires, one of your principles of operation requires cooperation among cooperatives. So the two have to get together, and they owe it to their members to work on a cooperative basis. With that, if you've got any questions and you don't want to bring them up here, feel free to send me an email. One question I had was, what does RBOC stand for? And I use that term loosely. Regional Belt Operating Question, or Regional Belt Operating Company, and Jerry Schneider will talk more about those types of things in his presentation. Thank you.
Shannon, thank you so much for a really informative presentation. We're going to move now to our next presenter. I'd like to introduce Jerry Schneider, who is the CEO and General Manager of Marquette Adams Telephone Cooperative. He joined the cooperative in 2009 and leads a capable team that's seen the cooperative increase its customer base by over 60% and grow its internet and television customer base by over 200%. In 2017, the cooperative received the Smart Rural Community Award from NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. Jerry has over 30 years of industry experience with over 20 years in Wisconsin. This has included past positions at Frontier in retail sales management and as state vice president and general manager. He was business development manager for Rhinelander Telecommunications prior to their acquisition by Frontier. And prior to moving to Wisconsin, Jerry had worked for Alltel and eventually through acquisition, GTE. So now, Jerry, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to get my screen up there.
Okay.
There we go. I think, you know, Lynn, thank you for giving a little bit of background. And I guess kind of when we're looking at, you know, broadband deployment decisions, you know, I wanted to talk about that and see what I could add as far as perspective. I think what I can bring is I was involved in decisions at the very large company level, even developing capital plans for, you know, Fortune 500 companies and how they were deploying. And then, you know, my, you know, experience here for a very small cooperative. And I think, you know, it gives you different perspectives. Some of them are more formal processes, but basically a lot of them are very similar. You know, you're looking at, you know, deploying it where it makes, where it's got to be economically viable. So you're looking at that. And in both situations, I guess I'll switch, talk a little bit more about my cooperative for a little bit more background, and then delve into some of that decision-making process. All right. Hopefully I'm going down here. All right. My screen is, oh, there we go. The cooperative that I worked for was established in 1951. And then it was truly, our name is still Telephone Cooperative, and that is one of the services we provide, but we're really more of a broadband company with different things coming in over the top of it. We've grown, took a big leap starting in 2010. We had a franchise territory in the state for many years. Those things got loosened up, and then we expanded quite a bit in that, our growth, you can see it going from 3,100 members to 5,100. Most of our customers, besides a voice line, which is something that we require our customers to have for various reasons. Some of it, we're in some revenue pooling situations would make it, it's cheaper for us to provide the line than provide service without that line. 89% of the customers, take high-speed internet. We just upped our bandwidth on our most popular package to 300 megabits per second down and 20 up. A typical DSL connection is the more traditional phone connection is you're doing well if you get a 10 by 1. So you can see this, it's our particular speeds are on our most popular package, and it's not outrageously priced either, is 30 times that speed. Long distance is a service we offer. Some areas that's a service because of some of it regulatory and costing. It's hard for us to get the cost down to the rock bottom on that in certain areas. There's things that we can do for very large customers that allow us to be very competitive. We bypass certain parts of our network to do that. We have a very robust TV offering. 58% of our customers take that. We were one of the first several companies in the nation to provide linear TV, 4K TV. It's like high definition. If you're not familiar with it, most TVs are coming out with it now built in there, but it's 4 times as sharp or pixel ratings as the high definition television as we've known it for some time. Most of our customers take all these services from us, and that's very helpful to us because a big part of the cost is getting that connection into the customer in the first place. So once we get it in there, you can layer on, some of the areas are more profitable than others. Television is one that it's a struggle to maintain profitability. It's one of the more expensive things we offer, but about 75% of the costs go right to the programmers. So it's kind of, we really work on behalf of our customers as best we can to provide value on those things. We offer, video on demand to our customers as well. And I want to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about partnerships. You get a picture of where we're at. We're, of the cooperative world, we're the furthest east. We're in, Lynn was talking about in the west, and indeed most of the cooperatives are all the rest of the telephone cooperatives are further east than we are. We're located just a little bit northeast of Wisconsin Dells. Our footprint has expanded. We've basically doubled our footprint in the last 9 years. And in areas, Shannon was talking about, we went out into these areas. We were a recipient of a large federal grant. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that later on as well. But and we got a really good acceptance. We guessed right. We were right on target with the percentage of customers that we thought would be there. But that area of people continue, since we weren't the incumbent phone company in those areas. It wasn't natural if you weren't a big internet user. You were satisfied with the satellite TV. There wasn't the big, as big of a mandated use of us. Right now, we find that we've got about 2/3 of the customers in areas that we've elected to overbuild to. This is a more targeted view of what we look like. We're bumping right up against Wisconsin Dells there in the southwest part of it. And when you look at saying rural, the largest area that we service 100% of is Oxford, which is a town of 600. So, but we've reached into, if you look at this map, in the area that's in red, we serve anybody in that area, we'll serve them. There are areas that are in green, are areas that we went out to more on a linear, customer request basis. And again, with the customer request basis, some of it is already absorbed in that red, so it wasn't, but on the areas that are depicted in green on that slide, we serve just certain routes into that area. And, usually a lot of it has been, certain customer requests, whether it be a big customer of ours, our, cell towers, and then there are large businesses that have some demands that they feel that they need better than what they have been able to get. This is a map of the different telephone companies in the state. When you look at it, sometimes if you're used to, especially if you come out of like an urban area, Milwaukee, Madison, you think, well, AT&T is the incumbent provider. I've got certain choices from the cable TV companies, and it's really getting, really when you look at it between the cable TV companies and what had been the traditional, telephone companies, we're offering very similar services at this point. We have a little bit different regulatory constraints, but basically a lot of those have been taken off to give us more flexibility. One of the things that we still do in the telephone side is we provide service into the very rural areas like farms, where the traditional cable companies, they may go into smaller towns, but it's generally not their practice to go into the very rural areas. Provided this just as a kind of a backdrop so you could see, okay, what phone companies. Shannon had charts there of, okay, you've got a cooperative, you've got an independent telephone company, and then you've got a larger phone company. And you can kind of look at here and say, if your current provider isn't meeting your needs, who might be close? So that's one of the reasons I offered up this slide. This is an interesting map. It's this WIN is owned by 31 independent phone companies in Wisconsin, and it's been a wonderful way to share our backbone, and it's went beyond Wisconsin for various opportunities that have presented itself. And you know, this network here on you know, the independents in Wisconsin, there are similar networks in most other states, and then our networks can link together. So if you have a business that needs connection, you know, between the businesses, you know, more so than over the open net, but you want a dedicated connection, those, you know, that backbone network exists to help us provide those solutions. So when you look at, when a telephone company, a broadband provider looks at, you know, where they're going to deploy their, you know, their resources, both the commercial companies and the cooperatives, you know, you look at if the project is going to be economically viable. I would say the threshold on a cooperative isn't, you know, it's a lower bar. We're not, my board doesn't ask me, we have to be able to pay our bills. We certainly discuss our finances on a regular basis, but our goal isn't necessarily to maximize profit. If we can keep our rates to our customers reasonable, that is meeting one of our objectives as well. You know, that's a little bit different on perspective, but, you know, when you look at it, all of us have to do, you know, certain project prioritization. We don't have an unlimited pot of money. You know, some projects would have a better economic return, but we do look at as well, as part of being tied to the community as close as we are. Remember, our members, the people we provide service to, help govern their, you know, that's where my board of directors comes from. You have to have service from us before you can serve on my board, which I think gives it a real good perspective as far as cost in line, the service bundles that we offer. So that's a very much of a positive. I've spent, you know, I've been here almost 10 years, but you know, means the other 22, 23 years of my career I've spent on the commercial side. And, you know, all of us try and provide as good a service as we can. It's just the resources on what's in the rural community is, you know, I think we do a much better job because that's our entire focus. You know, when you look at it, as far as the investments, you know, right now you know, my company has invested, you know, in 1,400 miles of fiber optic cable. We serve about 450 square miles in some pretty rural areas. One of the ways we've been able to, you know, to do that is, you know, through looking for anchor institutions and following up on there. Another is on looking for grants that would help us reduce those costs. So, you know, one of the things I think I'll switch and look at, you know, if you're looking at wanting to get broadband in your area, you know, kind of this is, you know, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, this is kind of the words of wisdom, I guess, is, you know, how do I make decisions? And that, you know, because I get the number one reason people call, that I get a call transferred into me, is people wanting to discuss how they can get broadband into their area. And we do a lot. If it's fairly close, we, you know, we'll do it as long as it doesn't provide a burden to the rest of the cooperative, and I have enough capital that year to do it. So here's my suggestions. You know, that you contact whoever your current area broadband provider is. You know, whether that's a large company or you know, a small company, but it's much cheaper if you're currently in the area to make it happen. Try and get to a decision maker. You know, who would be making these, you know, ask who would be making these decisions. They have a local area manager, you know, try and get to that person. and then continue to follow up. You know, we've all got more things to do than time, you know, time to do. And we may have, you know, an interest. We haven't made a yes or no decision, but keep going until you get a solid yes or no decision. If the decision is, you know, ways to influence that positively is, you know, ask them if, you know, any aid to construction would be helpful. They'll, you know, generally come back with a number of what that might be. And if that cost is prohibitive, then, you know, your next option is to contact a nearby, you know, telecommunications provider, whether that be cooperative or commercial. You might be in an area where there's no cooperatives, and very likely, you know, as looking at it as a state, you probably are in areas most people do not have a telephone cooperative anywhere where reasonably close. So, but there might be another independent commercial company, and they're, you know, the smaller the company, the more tied they are to the community. So, you know, you can discuss, you know, different solutions that might make sense, and I'm going to cover a few out-of-the-box solutions that we've come up with that kind of maybe stimulate you in that area of what you mean by creative solutions. Well, when you know, some of it, when you look at how we've been able to expand, you know, targets of opportunity, you know, looking for ways that we may not be able to construct on our own with our, you know, completely, it may not be economically viable. A very large one that occurred that allowed us to really, for the first time, offer, you know, besides certain internet products outside of our territory, offered us to, you know, to get a full line of fully fiber-based services was during the, when they wanted to do some things to stimulate the economy after the stock market downturn that happened and the economy going south. I had never seen, you know, this was a unique offering at the time, and the scale of it remains unique. We had a $20 million award that allowed us to put in about 450, you know, 500 miles of fiber optic cable into areas that we would not have been able to do, just would have been cost prohibitive. 69% of those funds, you know, came as a grant, and then, you know, you had another, the rest of it, 31%, we were on the hook for, still are, and we're paying that off over time. So it was a one-time program. The state has stepped in and, you know, trying to continue that process, leverage private investment with public, and we've had a couple of awards here this year that are allowing me to add, you know, some more subscribers, you know, get into areas where they can get fully fiber-based. And again, my network is 100% fiber to the premise and has been until, you know, since 2014. When you look at the size of this, at the same time we were spending this 20 million, we were, you know, in the middle of upgrading our own network, both fiber and electronics, that during a, you know, like an 8-year period there that we spent 25 million on our core network, you know, to make sure that that, you know, kept up to snuff. When you look at the level of services, you know, sometimes people talk about, hey, you have as good as you have in the city. Well, in our particular case, you know, the stuff that you heard from Google is going to build a fiber network in Kansas City, or, you know, my customers, you know, get, you know, service definitely on that level, better than you can in an urban area. And I know that's not the case for, you know, many areas. It's almost, in addition to the urban-rural divide, there's the rural-rural divide there, you know, on different opportunities depending on who your provider is. Some other things that have allowed us to expand the backhaul to cellular sites. That is a lucrative portion of our business. And, when we go out to those sites, usually we enter into long-term agreements to serve those, and we provide backhaul services to, Verizon, AT&T, US Cellular, the major carriers in our state. And because when you make a cell call, it hits that tower, and they have a choice of either microwaving it to another tower or bringing it down to fiber to hit a switch. And fiber is, as more and more data is getting out there, fiber is definitely becoming more and more the preferred solution. So when you look at our participation, yes, we're a traditional landline phone company, but it's almost when your cell phone, it comes down and still gets transported on our network. It's more like a wholesale arrangement versus a retail. So another interesting anecdote here, we had a customer who just couldn't get the broadband connection, both from a reliability and a bandwidth situation that they wanted. We quoted them a cost to construct, on what it would, what it would cost us, and we always look at, okay, what other business am I going to be able to get at that time? But it was still that they would have had to contribute a couple $100,000, which was cost prohibitive to them. So what we ended up doing is we had access to be on a cell tower. We were serving a school. We knew the people who owned that tower, and so we were able to get a very reasonable rate to get on that tower. And we worked with them to do a point-to-point microwave solution. In that case, giving them, and it could have been more, but we were giving them a 50 megabit synchronous connection, and that was several years ago. They're still using it, happy, seems to be working well for them. Another solution, we had some campgrounds wanted some worry-free wireless access and didn't want to pay the capital investment. We have several sites where we've offered a service where we'll go in there, we put up multiple nodes, and then if customers go in, if they can get their bandwidth, they can just pay for, if they need it for an hour, a day, a week, a month, they can pay for what they need and get an appropriate pricing for what they need. And then it's completely worry-free to the campground. The campgrounds that have used it just love it, and we provide other services to those campgrounds as well, as far as camera work for them and other things. So that's somebody who didn't want the upfront capital investment. In that case, we put in 25 nodes, and that campground completely has a wireless mesh at a gigabit level where they can be driving in their golf cart from place to place, and they won't miss the movie that they're streaming. So pretty interesting stuff from my perspective. Wanted to talk about cooperation among cooperatives. Adams Columbia Electric Cooperative, we have a lot of common areas with them, and frankly, we've been in some partnerships with them on certain things in the past. They had a situation where they came to us at their headquarters, which is in a town a little bit north. We were in that southern part of that town to get a couple of cell towers, and we had some businesses along that line. But we had, they approached us. They weren't getting as reliable service as they wanted from the internet and their telephone and long distance. And we looked at it, and there was a hospital that also wanted some help there, and another business. So together we kind of pooled, we entered into long-term agreements. All of them were told, hey, hey, I have to get all of these, and then this would be the offer if that happens. So there's a lot of discussion and timing. We were able to do it. They've been quite happy with all these customers with going from a very limited bandwidth to in all their cases a couple hundred megabit synchronous connections and very decently priced telephone and long distance services. That led to some other discussions of Adams Columbia wanting their substations hooked up to fiber, and Shannon talked about that a little bit. People want to get on a smart grid, helps them better manage their electricity, and it's better if it's in a closed network for security-wise. We initially hooked up 6 of those that were in our common territories. We built the 2 more that we were pretty close to. Then we had negotiated with some neighboring telephone companies to pick up another 9 that are being brought on board this year. And they wanted us, they had approached us wanting to get out to even more sites. We talked about it. We tried to get a broadband grant. It was a large request. That one we weren't successful in, but immediately after learning that, I got on the phone with their CEO, and we're discussing, okay, we'll scale back. What are we going to do? We've got to have some meetings on that. Adams Columbia's footprint is, and I brought up this map. We're the company in blue on there. And Adams Columbia is, you can see there, they're quite a bit larger than we are. They want us to build, we're going to entertain the idea of building all the way up here because we can pick up some customers en route and help defray some of the costs, but add to their service center in Wautoma, and then also to the east with the service center that they got in Partyville. But it's a project. We're trying to work together, and I think using us. I mean, I've worked with these phone companies for many years, and I think we kind of negotiated rates on their behalf that are much more favorable than they could have done it on their own. And it passes back through our network, and so that's a joint, kind of an example of a joint project here. I'm a little conscious of my time here. I see we're about wrapping it up here a little bit. All right, I got to go down with this thing, and it's misbehaving. All right, there we go. We had a condo association near a boundary that wanted us to build for it. And instead of anybody would just sign a petition, but we made them prepay so much. And we if they had 30, we said we would do it at our cost. We were able to get 31 of 41 members. We tried a similar approach in a town where that town had come to us 3 different times and really approached us. We just couldn't make it work, but we're going to go piece by piece and serve it. We're already serving, and all the large businesses in that town, but filling in the residential now is, we'll take that piece by piece. In summary, I guess the need to explore options, and it's not going to be a quick process if you need to expand how do you get somebody to deploy to you? I guess looking at the time, that's the end of my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Jerry, for a very informative presentation. We're at noon, but if folks have a couple of extra minutes, there were a couple of questions, and perhaps there's some brief answers. Jerry and Shannon, if you'd be available, I've got one question here that says, are you aware of anyone providing service by connecting to the fiber backhaul network of a telco provider?
We are. and Jerry, I imagine Jerry has some of those situations as well. Typically, the telco providers will take what we would call a middle mile perspective. A little bit depends on who you're serving and where, what the needs are, and there is a pricing model for it. We work with a company, and I know that both Laval and Richland Grant do, that is it's a wireless provider. They're what we would call a WISP, a wireless internet service provider. They basically take care of the last mile. They have the customer relationship outside of our service territory, and they connect to us. When you say connect to the fiber, I'm assuming that means you get the internet wholesale and all of that. We will take that middle mile approach. It's a little bit of what Jerry was talking about with cell towers too. They're doing what would be termed middle mile. The cellular provider is providing data via the cellular network. So there are people that are doing that. It is a little bit case by case specific. I don't know if Jerry's got more to add there.
Well, yeah, I think you covered that part. I was just looking at some notes. I mean, we among, cooperatives, we share a lot of services. I share head-end services with a group that 20 of us, smaller telephone companies, on our own, we may not be able to do some of the sophisticated stuff, but together we can. And I get my internet backbone from a shared resource that we're part of the ownership structure of. We provide video on demand to 500 telephone companies. We'd ask for some contribution up front, and then after that, we've been able to maintain it, not ask for another capital, infusion. I suppose it's possible if we might need it in the future, but we looked at it and we were providing it anyway, and we'll help them get on board. And it makes us a larger entity when we buy video on demand resources, and we don't mark it up. They're buying at the same rate we are, but we're cooperating together.
Great, thank you. I've got another, just really quickly, a question from someone who works with a federal land management agency and has had some pushback from visitors who want to unplug or don't want Wi-Fi, or specific individuals in rural communities that say that broadband or Wi-Fi is a threat to traditional rural values. Now, both of you all deal with community economic development questions, and I was wondering if you just had a quick response to that.
Shannon, let me take the lead on this one. I think it's just the opposite. It allows, like on these campgrounds that we're serving, what I'm getting from the campground owners is it's allowing those people to enjoy the rural environment more, because they don't have to go back and take care of business outside of it. So, I mean, I just think having decent broadband, the reality is people need to be more, connected for a variety of reasons, and just providing that, the people certainly can choose how much they want to use or not.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I agree. And the question is, how have I responded to that? Really a two-part question there. People want to unplug and don't want Wi-Fi, and it sounds like this is maybe another, a similar agency to the question, the person asking the question saying, no, we really don't want to do that because our visitors don't want it. Well, that's kind of a captive question. The people you ask are the people who are visiting, and they say they don't want it. Of course they don't. That's why they're there. But what about all of the people that aren't coming because they do want it? Personally, I can unplug. I know how to unplug, but I probably am going to go where I can plug in if I want to. And if it's not there, I've ruled them out on day one. I'm not going there. For me to stay in a hotel anymore that doesn't have Wi-Fi access is almost unheard of. It's got to be the only one that's there. I enjoy my unplug time. As it relates to the second part of the question, threatening traditional rural values, that clearly is an economic development question. That's akin to saying, I've moved into the community I like without any broadband, and I want to shut the door behind me on the way in. Well, the reality of that is that if you don't have this broadband, the economic vitality of the community is going to suffer. traditional rural values only stand when people live there. And if you can't entice more investment in your community, whether that be through additional tax base by more housing or new jobs or new employment, those traditional rural values are not, they're going to suffer. That's, in my view, that's a destination poverty. And so I would argue you can unplug anytime you want, and I would respond to say, you know what, if you don't see this progress as being essential to your future success, you need to look at a little bit bigger picture.
Thanks. And I have one last question, and that is that oftentimes 5G is talked about as a possible solution to some of these access questions. And I wonder if either or both of you have any final thoughts on that.
5G, you know, yes, it's going to provide a much higher level of bandwidth, but it requires many more cell towers. And it'll be deployed first in the urban areas, and it's going to be very expensive to get in the truly, you know, the small towns, I think, can benefit from that. But the true rural areas, it's just, at least for the short-term future, I don't think you're going to see it.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other point is 5G can't exist without the fiber network. You have to understand that in 5G, and I'm in Southwest Wisconsin, driftless region, where we have a lot of elevation changes. Even in a good environment, 5G reach is 300 meters. So if you can go that from an antenna to a point of presence to somebody using it, we're limited to 900 feet. I don't have a subscriber every 900 feet in a rural area. I mentioned 3.4 per mile. That would, if they were equal, they'd be 1,500 feet plus apart. 5G is going to make pretty good inroads in densely populated areas. It will migrate out to somewhat less urban areas, what we might even call rural. Jerry used the term rural divide, and I agree with that. But 5G, there's a lot of promise. It has low latency and high bandwidth. But it has to have the fiber for the backhaul. So you kind of make 5G available for a high-speed mobility application on top of a fixed fiber network.
Right, and it's a cell phone-based solution, right?
Typically, now you're hearing about it in a cell phone. That's where you're talking about cell phones. You know, the 5G technology may not have to be limited to cell phones. I suppose you could go to fixed wireless, some sort of fixed device. I don't know why you would, but yeah, it typically is provided across that same. I guess the way to say it is the existing cellular carriers are likely going to be the 5G providers because they bought into that spectrum.
Okay.
And you know, they can elect to put a device in the house that will then spread it out, but on the, you know, and use, you know, all the services. But again, as Shannon pointed out, you know, the density, you know, where they're going to initially deploy, you know, it's just, you know, they've already got multiple options, most likely, you know. So the rural area, true rural area, I don't think you're going to see that being of great benefit, at least in the short term.
Okay. All right. Well, we're a little bit over our time, but I want to give again a very big thank you to Shannon and Jerry for an extremely informative set of presentations. I'll be sending out links to this webinar, which is being recorded, as well as then the presentations that will also be posted on our website. I'll also send out an evaluation, very short evaluation, and we'd really appreciate your taking the time to fill it out. So at this point, thank you all for participating, and thank you again, Jerry and Shannon. Have a good afternoon, everyone.